pleasure to be presenting some of the results of my work. This is the first time that I've had a chance to present some of them, and so I hope you'll have plenty of questions, feedback. Let me start by explaining what I'm talking about. What is child marriage? 2 words, 2 very big and complex concepts. Who falls into the category of a child varies dramatically across societies and is also very dramatically over time within societies. Right? So we have differing definitions of childhood. We also have differing understandings of what constitutes marriage. Most of us have some sort of idea within North America of either a religious or perhaps a civil ceremony involving specific types of officials, a marriage license. But common law unions are also becoming increasingly common in Canada and elsewhere. The United Nations gives us a very specific definition of child marriage. It's the formal or informal marriage of any person before the age of 18. There's a long history to this definition, some of which we will cover in the next few slides. But it's also worth noting that that threshold at 18 is arbitrary. That threshold could be 19, it could be 17. Even though it's arbitrary, it squares pretty well with most Canadian policies. The age of majority is set at least 18 in every province. It's 19 in about half of them. So we're used to understanding 18 as a cut point for different permissibility of differing behaviors. The notion that child marriage is harmful or a violation of human rights is not a new concept. In fact, it's been with us since the first efforts to formalize what human rights are. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights mentions that men and women of full age have the right to marry. No specific indication at that time of what full age is or should be. 14 years later, in 1962, we actually have a specific human rights document, the Convention on Consent to Marriage, Minimum Age for Marriage, and Registration of Marriages, that required member states of the UN to set a minimum. Again, it didn't provide any explicit guidance on what the minimum should be, but required nations to set a minimum. It's worth noting that in 1979, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, commonly referred to as CEDAW, just reiterates the same requirement. The need to reiterate that requirement that countries establish a minimum is repeated in CEDAW documentation, goes a little bit farther in stating that the marriage of children shall have no legal effect, but once again, we don't have a uniform definition of what constitutes a child marriage. Just this notion that at some point, young marriage or the marriage of young people is harmful and that they should be protected against it. The fact that this goes from being a general human rights concern in the Declaration of Human Rights and a general human rights concern on this Convention on Consent to Marriage to something that's explicitly an issue of women's rights is also notable here. We're going to talk about child marriage as an indicator of gender inequality. It wasn't until more recently, 1989, 1990, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that we get this definition. This convention defines a child as every human being below the age of 18 years, with this exception unless under applicable law, majority is attained earlier. Of course, for Canada, that doesn't apply. Majority is 18 or 19. The African Union adopted a similar document at approximately the same time, also indicating that they define a child as anyone below the age of 18. So since 1990, when this came into effect, we've seen a proliferation of efforts to end child marriage, because now we have a standardized definition. If we call anybody under the age of 18 a child, we can start to quantify child marriage. This standardized definition facilitates monitoring of child marriage practices across the globe and is something that we can base development targets on. I'm going to go ahead and assume that everyone in this room is familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to focus on SDG 5, on gender equality. SDG 5, in its full statement, is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. That is a lovely and lofty goal. How do we know if we're actually making progress towards that aim? Well, the UN sets specific measurable targets that are associated with each of these goals. For SDG 5, one of those measurable targets is the percentage of girls who marry before the age of 18. So this is now enshrined in Global Development Goals as a function of having been standardized through the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The goal, of course, is to end all child marriage by the year 2030. So how are we doing? This map is taken from an NGO called Girls Not Brides, one of the largest NGOs dealing with child marriage internationally. And it shows the prevalence of child marriage among girls at a national level across most of the globe. You'll notice that there's no information provided for many regions, including North America, most of Western Europe, and we're going to discuss that a little bit later in the presentation. The hotspots for child marriage, in terms of the data that we have, tend to be South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Niger and Chad have some of the highest rates, with almost 3/4 of girls marrying before the age of 18, according to some most recent demographic and health surveys. The majority of these married children are girls, right? This is all female child marriage, ranging as high as 76%, as I mentioned. But for boys, the average prevalence was 4.5%. This is why child marriage is considered a marker of gender inequality. This is why it gets used as a target towards SDG 5. There's incredibly gendered in nature. In most societies, almost exclusively female. So, why are we concerned about it? There's a large body of research on the consequences, associations of negative consequences with child marriage. Compared to their peers who marry later, girls who get married report having less access to contraception. They report having more unwanted pregnancies. They experience domestic violence more frequently, and they're at greater risk of acquiring HIV. Taken together, much of this research paints a picture of married girls having limited control over their sexual and reproductive health. And this fits much of the narrative that we have about child marriage. It's often female, it's often young girls marrying substantially older men. A large age discrepancy between partners can contribute to a power dynamic between those individuals that decreases particularly a young wife's agency to demand contraception, demand condom use, or even control the frequency of sex. This puts her out of control of her own fertility and reproduction. It's also important to note that almost all of this research is based on South Asian and Sub-Saharan African populations. We know very, very little about child marriage practices outside of those regions. Beyond health, child marriage is also associated with lower educational attainment. Girls who marry before the age of 18 have less schooling than their peers who get married a bit later. And this, of course, has potentially lifelong implications for their economic opportunities. If you have very limited schooling, that limits your job opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. It's also important to note that the directionality of this relationship in particular is unclear. In a lot of advocacy work around child marriage, it would be portrayed as though child marriage causes a girl to leave school early. The common narrative is a young girl is promised in marriage, she's then forced to leave school. This is very likely the case in some parts of the globe. There's good evidence from Bangladesh, where public schooling systems are relatively stronger than in other parts of the world, that this is in fact the case. If a girl gets married, she leaves school as a result of that change in her marital status. But in other parts of the world, the vast majority of young girls never attend formal schooling. So this may in fact work in the other direction. Child marriage could be perceived as an opportunity for moving forward with your life. If you cannot attend school, or there aren't opportunities for you to do so, you may move into marriage as, to use the sociological phrase, a different way of transferring into adulthood. Moving from a child to an adult through marriage. If we understand that it's particularly harmful, why does it continue to happen? Poverty and gender inequality are often described as the joint drivers of child marriage. Once again, these narratives are most familiar in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, where in contexts where there are very limited resources, those resources might be differentially diverted to boys, and so marrying off a girl child can actually relieve her natal family of having to care for her. She goes to live with her husband's family and is then their responsibility. But it's important to recognize social norms in terms of what's an acceptable age for marriage in different societies, and efforts to control sexuality. Right? This goes hand in hand with social norms, but child marriage is often perceived as a way to protect girls from the potential stigma that can come along with premarital sexual activity that may be voluntary or involuntary. The risk of sexual violence is very real and is thought to diminish a girl's marriageability were that to happen. So marrying her as early as possible could be perceived by her family as a way to protect her from that. Again, our current understanding comes from very limited regions of the world. Canada has placed itself at the forefront of global efforts to end child marriage. Global Affairs is particularly concerned with child marriage. This image is taken from the Global Affairs website and lists a lengthy list of actions that the government is taking to end child marriage in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals. A few examples. In 2018, Canada co-sponsored the first UN resolution on ending child early and forced marriage in collaboration with Zambia. You can find this on the Global Affairs website, along with a statement from Chrystia Freeland, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, acknowledging the harms of child marriage and Canada's commitment to ending it. In 2017, the government adopted its Feminist International Assistance Policy, which essentially means that foreign aid gets particularly funneled towards efforts that favor the advancement and empowerment of women and girls. And the policy explicitly aims to curb child early and forced marriage. Public resources are also diverted to this in large form. This just from last summer, Trudeau at a conference called Women Deliver in June of 2019, acknowledging or announcing for the first time that Canada is going to increase its funding for women's health worldwide to $1.4 billion annually starting in 2023. This was a direct response to US foreign policy, which was actually pulling back from funding women's reproductive health. Collectively, all of these efforts indicate that, at least in the perception of the Canadian government, child marriage is something that occurs elsewhere. We're primarily concerned about this as a matter for global affairs, our international aid, etc. The troubling thing is that child marriage is legal throughout Canada. The Federal Civil Marriage Act was updated in 2015 to prohibit marriage before the age of 16. Prior to 2015, the minimum was set as low as 14. It varied a bit between provinces and territories. Children aged 16 and 17 can legally marry in every province and territory of Canada if their parents consent. An added caveat that in Quebec since 2016, judicial approval is also required if you want to marry before the age of 18. So my question was, how many actually do? Right? Maybe this is just a law that's on the books that permits child marriage, but it doesn't actually happen. Well, it turns out that the Canadian government doesn't keep any systematic records of who marries before the age of 18 or how common that is. So, this has been the focus of my research for the past year, about 18 months. I started by contacting vital statistics agencies in each province and territory. Any of you who might have gotten formally married in Canada will understand why this is. If you want to legally wed in the country, you have to go to a vital statistics agency, apply for a marriage license. If that's granted, you take that marriage license with you. You have some sort of ceremony, either civil or religious, where an authority signs off on the license. You then return it to your vital statistics office, and they issue you a marriage certificate. That's your legal proof of your union. They also keep a record of that marriage certificate. And I asked them for data from those marriage licenses filed between 2000 and 2018. Those licenses record pretty limited information about a couple, but they usually include the age of both parties and their genders, at a very minimum. This is what I found. This is the number of children under the age of 18 who were granted marriage certificates across provinces between 2000 and 2018. These are just absolute numbers, so not surprising to see the largest number of certificates issued in the most populous province. But we go from 1,300 in Ontario, almost 800 in Alberta, down to 7 in Newfoundland, and fewer than 5 in the territories and PEI. What I take from this is that child marriage occurred in every province and territory over this time period. It wasn't limited to one particular region of the country, at least geographically. The total was at least 3,687. I say at least because these provinces didn't give me a specific number because it was fewer than 5. And in keeping with their Vital Statistics Act, they couldn't give me a specific count. What does this look like when broken down by gender? Well, I think it's pretty clear from this image that much like elsewhere in the world, child marriage is overwhelmingly female in Canada. In every province where we were actually able to get a breakdown by gender, more than 85% of the children married were girls. You'll notice a few glaring omissions here. Ontario does not record gender on its marriage licenses, so we weren't able to look at this breakdown by gender.
Can you get this something approaching this from census data?
I'll talk about census data in the second part. How old are children when they marry? I was interested not just in how many under the age of 18, how many of them are 16 and 17? The vast majority of both girls and boys are 17 years old when they marry, but there's a difference by gender, again. Nearly a quarter of girls married at the age of 16, 9% of boys married at the age of 16. We did find 8 cases in which girls married before the age of 16. Those all occurred prior to the change in the law in 2015, when marriage at 14 was still legal. The youngest did marry at the age of 14. I think 7 of these occurred in Alberta, 1 in BC. When I talk about my research, one of the first questions that I'm often asked is, well, are these just sweetheart marriages? This is a 17-year-old girl who's in love with her 18-year-old boyfriend, and it's romantic. They want to get married. Right? They're just precocious and deciding to move into this phase of life a little bit earlier than their peers. There's a tendency to romanticize it, I find. Using data from the marriage certificates again, I was able to subtract the age of the spouses. And this is what I found. I'll explain this a bit. This is the age difference on this axis. So I subtracted the husband's age from the wife's age. On the top bracket, we're looking at child marriages when the husband was under the age of 18. So if you compare this top panel with this lower panel, once again, it's very much driven home that child marriage is overwhelmingly female in Canada. We have very few marriages where boys under the age of 18 are wed. And when they do wed, they tend to be marrying people who are very similar to them in age, right? This is a difference of 0 means that these are 2 17-year-olds who got married. A difference of -1 would be a 16-year-old boy marrying a 17-year-old girl, for instance. Down here on the female side of the panel, we see exactly the opposite. Girls are much more likely to marry men who are substantially older than they are. Very few of them marrying people who are exactly the same age. And we see that the tail of this distribution is much longer for girls than it is for boys. Right? Our most extreme outlying case over here is a difference of 34 years. It's a 16-year-old girl married to a 50-year-old man. That happened in 2017. To put this a little bit differently, only 14% of these marriages involved 2 children who were either of the same age or within 1 year of each other. In over a third of cases, these were girls under the age of 18 marrying men who were at least 5 years older than they were, and in 6% of cases, girls who were under the age of 18 marrying men who were 10 or more years their senior. So, what about common law unions? Right? Remember that definition of child marriage, according to the UN, includes both formal, so what I would interpret as legal marriages, as indicated by the presence of a marriage certificate, but common law unions as well. Right? 2 people who are living together as if married without the legal recognition of such, or without the presence of a certificate. Here, we turn to the census. The census records the current marital status of everyone over the age of 15, which is actually interesting, right? Because you can't actually legally get married at 15 in Canada. So why they continue asking about it at 15 is an interesting question. One important thing to note, a limitation of the census data, is that we can't be sure that these marriages actually occurred in Canada. Unlike the vital statistics data, where we know that those are marriages that were certified in the country, these could be marriages that occurred elsewhere, among people who either left the country to get married somewhere else, or people who immigrated to Canada and were already married. If you've filled out the census, these are what the questions look like in particular. What is this person's marital status? You get these options: never married, legally married, separated, divorced, or widowed. And then there's a follow-up question. Is this person living with a common law partner? So this allowed me to estimate the prevalence of both formal and common law marriages involving minors across the country in different census years. Here it is. The dark green bars are the prevalence, that's the percent of all 15 to 17-year-olds in the country who were in formal marriages. The lighter green is the percent of 15 to 17-year-olds in the country who were in common law unions. So we see that in 2001 and 2006, formal marriages were just a hair more common than common law unions among minors. But by the time we get to 2016, common law unions are actually 20 times as common as formal marriages. Formal marriages have dropped off dramatically over this time period of all sorts, right? Both common law and formal unions are less common in 2016 than they were earlier. These percentages are small, right? In 2016, I'm talking about 0.2% of 15 to 17-year-olds who were in a common law union. It sounds like a small percentage. That's equivalent to approximately 2,380 married children living in Canada. So a small percentage, you can be the judge of how large you feel the absolute number is. If we break it down by provinces and territories, this is what we get. This is again the number of 15 to 17-year-olds who are either married or in a common law union per 10,000 in 2016. It's pretty uniform among much of the country, right? Alberta, Atlantic provinces, BC, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, all ranging between 10 and 30. Saskatchewan stands out. The territories stand out dramatically, right? This is equivalent to 1.7% of 15 to 17-year-olds living in the territories in either a formal marriage or a common law union. We break it down by gender. This is not surprising. Again, we see that girls are much more likely to be in unions, according to the census, than boys in every census year here, 2001, 2006, 2016. And again, we see that in general, child marriage has become less common. This is the prevalence by self-identified Indigenous status nationwide. The high prevalence, or relatively much higher prevalence of child unions in the territories prompted me to look at nationwide. What are we talking about among the subgroup of the population that identifies as Indigenous? It's pretty dramatic. Right? Those who identify as Indigenous, much more likely to be in child unions than those who don't. This finding actually matches up with my previous research in the United States, where we also found that children who identified as Native American in the US were at greater risk for child marriage than their peers who didn't identify as such. Another common comment that I get on this research is that, well, this could be primarily children who are immigrating to Canada, having been married somewhere else. And we did indeed find in the US that children who were born outside of the country were more likely to be married as children. The same was true in Canada in 2001 and 2006. Foreign-born children were almost twice as likely to be in child unions as those in Canada. But there's still a fairly substantial proportion of Canadian-born children who are in unions, right? This isn't specific to immigrant populations. In 2016, that's actually flipped. The difference is small. It's 1/10 of a percentage point, right? 0.1% of foreign-born children and 0.2% of Canadian-born children. But I think it's an interesting switch in terms of where these child marriages, the context of these child marriages. So in summary, before I get to the policy implications, just to sum up the research thus far, child marriage is legal and ongoing. It's not restricted to any geographical region of the country or any particular subgroup of the population, at least as far as we've been able to analyze with the census. It's rarer in Canada than in other parts of the world. Okay? We saw prevalence rates as high as 76% in the most extreme cases. But when it happens, it looks just like it does anywhere else. It's overwhelmingly female. It's primarily older adolescents, 16 to 17 years old, many of whom are marrying older men. So to come back to this, no data doesn't mean no child marriage. Okay? I find these images very interesting for that reason. Why is it that we only portray child marriage in certain parts of the world, right? Regions that we would primarily consider, we might refer to as low or middle income countries or the global south. It lends us to thinking that child marriage either doesn't occur elsewhere or isn't something that we need to be concerned about elsewhere. It allows us to conveniently wipe it from our minds. But what about Canada's commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Canada's a participant in these and produces a voluntary progress report on its work towards meeting the goals. Certainly they're acknowledging this, right? Not so much. This is the Sustainable Development Goals data hub that the government has put together, where they do monitor their own progress towards these goals, although they don't always adhere to the way that the indicators are supposed to be measured according to the UN. So you remember that the UN was interested in the proportion of girls under the age of 18 who married. What we get is the proportion of women aged 15 to 19 who were married or living common law. Why this is the case, I don't know. Certainly Statistics Canada has access to the same census data that I did, which with much less hassle than I had to go through to get it. And so it would be easily possible for them to report the percentage of girls under the age of 18 who were married. Instead, we get this 15 to 19 year range, which you could perceive as being conveniently obscuring the proportion under the age of 18. Right? This combines both minors under the age of 18 and those who are over the age of 18 and of their own agency to wed if they so choose. There's a clear discrepancy between Canada's domestic law and its foreign policy. This is pretty obvious, I would think, something that I've discussed with Global Affairs Canada and that they are very aware of. The permissibility of child marriage, I think, is a very interesting exception to other restrictions that we place on the freedoms of minors. If you're under the age of 18, you can't legally consume marijuana, you can't smoke, you can't legally drink. Doesn't necessarily mean that you don't do that, but according to the law, you are not permitted. You can't vote. Even if your parents go before your electoral commission and say, but my child is particularly mature and able to handle this responsibility, you're not permitted to get an exception. The idea of the age of majority is also an indicator of when you're considered mature enough or capable of signing contracts. In terms of child marriage, we've seen cases in the United States where this becomes a problem because a married minor can't legally, independently rent an apartment, can't sign a lease. It also becomes a problem with individuals I've spoken to in the United States where if you're a married 17-year-old and you'd like to get a divorce, you cannot independently hire an attorney to facilitate that process. I think that this deserves reflection. Why would we permit this exception and not others? And I strongly suspect, this is my suspicion, if we were to dig far enough into this question, that we would come up with the same indicators of gender inequality that we find elsewhere. Internationally, The continuing legality of this undermines Canada's efforts to curb the practice. It's very difficult for Canada to go out on an international stage and say, we aim to end this practice while we continue to condone it or permit it at home. Anecdotally, other countries are very much aware of this. Bangladesh updated its minimum age at marriage laws a couple of years ago and was very much aware of the fact they were being pushed by the international community to make the minimum 18 without exceptions. They decided to go with a minimum of 16. Guess why? The United States and Canada and other wealthy nations have their minimums at 16. And there's not a lot of leverage for foreign diplomats to argue that it should be higher when they're unwilling to adopt the same standards themselves. I would argue that understanding and addressing the social and political forces that perpetuate child marriage domestically would actually only serve to strengthen our credibility in trying to end this abroad. We'll talk about this a little more on the closing slide. I also think that Canada's failure to acknowledge that child marriage continues domestically perpetuates this idea that so-called development issues only occur in certain parts of the world. That there's a difference between us, the donor countries who give financial aid to these countries, and those countries that struggle with these issues. In fact, it exists on a spectrum. Child marriage is rarer here than it is elsewhere, but it continues to happen, and we continue to have that enacted in our domestic legislation. As a scientist, I'm hesitant to make recommendations about what we should do, but it's very convenient in this situation because I don't even have to. The government's done it for me. On Global Affairs' website, they have this list of items taking action at the local level. Local not meaning local as in Canada, but local meaning as in local communities internationally. This is a list of what they are doing globally through the Feminist and National Assistance Policy, through other programs to end child marriage. Creating safe spaces where girls can learn about their health and services available in their community. Working with families and communities to change attitudes and behaviors, particularly working with men and boys around attitudes regarding gender inequality, and working with cultural and religious leaders to inform them of some of the harms of child marriage. Working with parliamentarians to raise awareness about the negative consequences of child, early, and forced marriage, and working with governments to strengthen laws and policies that prevent child, early, and forced marriage. I think it would be much more compelling on a global stage if we could back all of these activities up with our own case study and say, we know it's challenging, here's how we did it. But at this point, we're not able to. That's what I have for you. I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
So we have about 18 minutes, 20 minutes for questions. I should say in advance that I have to go teach across the street at 1, so I'll be leaving and letting Alissa field her last couple of questions. So I won't be leaving because I'm offended by anything that she said, but because my students are waiting for me. So I'll take a few. So maybe, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of translating your research and communicating it with different spheres, potentially outside of the scientific community, how have you faced any challenges? Because child marriage is something that can cause a lot of alarm in like folks who aren't involved in this specific area of study. So have you run into any challenges? And if you have, how have you navigated those challenges?
That's a very good question and very well worded. I have had the opportunity to translate some of this research to the federal government. And last fall, I was invited to go to Ottawa and I spoke with representatives of Global Affairs, Justice Canada, Citizenship, Immigration and Refugees, a number of other agencies for whom this research is also relevant. They were, I would say, very receptive to this. Global Affairs was particularly aware that they know that this is a discrepancy. In terms of their ability to move this information into actual policy change, that depends on factors far beyond that individual agency, right? So it's one thing to put the research out there. I consider that to be a big step. One thing that they said that they were struggling with was they didn't have numbers. They knew that it was legal and that was creating a problem for them in terms of their authority in advocating these policies abroad, but they weren't able to say how common child marriage was in Canada. So this adds that piece of the puzzle. In terms of challenges outside of federal government that are well beyond my ability to manage, I would say that there has been a lot of surprise when I talk about this research to members of the public or people who are not in any way involved with global health. They're surprised to learn that marriage before the age of 18 remains legal, and even more surprised to learn that it still happens. I mentioned a couple of the common responses that I get, which is a tendency in my perspective to justify or romanticize it and say that, well, it must be different when it occurs here relative to when it occurs somewhere else. Certainly it's not as exploitative, we wouldn't permit that to happen. I would argue that much of this data contradicts that perception.
Chris.
Thanks for that very interesting talk. Actually, if I can start off with a comment, one of my favorite things, maybe my only favorite thing about the SDGs is the saying that in the context of the SDGs, all nations are developing nations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually said in the context of the sustainability side of things, but usually that's a broader truth. So you said that the age of 18 is a very arbitrary age. Is there a way to think about this or approach policy without a cutoff age? Because obviously there's some either racism or whatever difference in opinion about what should be the international standard. So is the solution not to argue about the number, but to do something a little deeper than come up with an age, which is it is ridiculous to stick with an age in some sense, right? Because there's a lot of individual variation. People are still developing into their mid-20s,
yeah.
Or I'm still probably developing myself then. So, I probably do a better job of marriage when I was 60 than when I was 30. So,
I think it's difficult to imagine implementing a policy without a threshold age. Right? We can certainly all acknowledge that there may indeed be 17-year-olds with very large amounts of agency who voluntarily choose to go into a marriage and for whom those outcomes may not be as harmful as they are on average in some of the statistics I mentioned in literature. Do you have something to add?
I do. I'm chomping at the bit. So, and I know the other questions, but I will blatantly abuse the privilege of the chair. So if you look at
were you done with the list done with that answer first?
Well, I wanted to acknowledge what
I'd like to hear what you have to say, but I want the answer first.
So, from my experience, I would say that it's difficult for me to imagine how a broad-reaching policy could be implemented without some sort of threshold. Other countries have tried to implement, judicial safeguards. Like, we have a threshold. If you want to marry below the threshold, you have to demonstrate to us that this is in the child's best interest. Of course, those policies can be abused as well, right? There are many cases in the United States where a child goes before a judge, in this instance, and is accompanied by her family, who may be the ones, in fact, pushing the marriage, which still limits her agency to say, I don't want to be a party to this. So that's my perspective on the issue. I would also note that 18 to me doesn't seem particularly intrusive. That's my opinion. And given what we now know about the developing brain into increasingly later ages. And in fact, no country is seeking to lower its thresholds, they're only raising them. Right? Indonesia raised its minimum to 19 at the end of the year, no exceptions. In other countries, it's actually 21. So this seems a lower bound.
You emphasize difference in age almost as much as you did the absolute age. So I'm just wondering if there's an angle there.
I haven't seen any instance where there's been a threshold in terms of difference in the age of spouses. Like we'll permit you to marry as a minor only if your spouse is within a certain degree of age. For the same reasons that age is an arbitrary threshold, any sort of cutoff in age distinction and age difference would be just adding more arbitrariness.
I want to put a little bit more pressure on you about the thresholds. So it is actually the case that with respect to a lot of important decisions, the pressure in a place like Quebec, Canada, has been downwards rather than upwards. So you can make pretty much all medical decisions for yourself without parental involvement.
Sure, health-related decisions.
Health-related decisions, medical in the medical sphere. For some as young as 14, and certainly by 16, you're pretty much free. The right to vote is an interesting one. I've been writing about that recently, and there's certainly a number of countries that have recently gone to 16. I would argue that there's no reason for us not to. That it's at this point a sort of unjustifiable, arbitrary limitation that we don't allow 16 and 17-year-olds. So to the extent, would it change your, and this goes in a way in the same sort of direction as Chris's question, would it change your perspective if it turned out that, not across the board, but with respect to a number of important decision-making functions, we were to lower, say, the voting age, we were to continue to do what we do in medicine and health, maintain the age of decision at 16, such that even though the age of, there are some things that we can only do as of 18, if the general pressure were downward, is there something specific that you think would lead you to say, even if it's okay to do that about these other decisions, we should still be intransigent about marriage?
Well, I would argue that those changes in lowering to 16 are also done in a specific context, right? So 16 is no less arbitrary than 18. There's no reason that we can say, if we're going to lower it, why shouldn't we lower it? Why shouldn't we have no minimum at all? Right? As soon as a person thinks that they have enough agency, or if their parents can argue on behalf of their agency, then why have a threshold? 16 is as arbitrary as 18. Would I argue, I think your question is, if everything else were to be changed to a minimum of 16, would I argue that the minimum for marriage should be kept at 18?
If similarly similarly important decision thresholds were to be lowered, would it make a difference?
If you were able to sign contracts and vote and had all of the other freedoms that we consider adult citizens within the country to have at 16, then I would think that it would be ridiculous to maintain one at the age of 18.
Okay, now I don't know whether it was the effect of that question, but we now have an explosion of hands.
Sumi was in line
Sumi,
first,
yeah.
I think.
So it could be all related to the arbitrary age of cutoff, but the importance in terms of implementing it as a policy. So unsurprisingly, the prevalence of under 18 marriage is much more common among indigenous populations. And in my own experiences of reproductive and prenatal health, it's quite common for them to have the first pregnancy or the first child under 20. So as is common for early marriage in that community and culture where it is considered a norm or regular or the part of their culture. So my question was, so it's clearly more detailed research is clearly needed. So have you thought about any ways or data sources or your plans or ideas to advance or to push this research forward so that we have more like full or better understanding of what is quote unquote appropriate or non-appropriate? At least in Canadian context.
In the Canadian context, absolutely. I have a grant proposal in right now that aims to try to push some of this forward. There's only so much farther I think that we can go with a lot of quantitative data. Because we're limited in terms of what exists, Vital statistics and the census are really the only two data sources that I'm aware of that would permit an examination of systemic child marriage within the country. Other data sources that ask about marriage, like the Canadian Community Survey or things like this, have sample sizes that are far too small to say anything meaningful. In terms of norms and consequences in particular, I'm interested in Canada and other high-income contexts. Right? As I mentioned, all of the research that we have on the negative health-related outcomes that are associated with child marriage come from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Dramatically different contexts where in many cases public health infrastructure is weaker, access to education may be weaker. It's unclear that the consequences would be of the same range or scope in a higher income country. They may in fact manifest very differently. And there's a little bit of quantitative work that we can do with that. In terms of norms and how people perceive child marriage or what the appropriate age of marriage is, I think there's a huge there's a lot of room for growth there. We haven't ever asked these questions. This is, to my knowledge, and I've done a systematic review on it, the first effort to try to quantify any type of child marriage at any age threshold within Canada. So qualitative research with different communities in terms of whether or not they perceive this as harmful or what the justifications might be would certainly add to our understanding. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. My question has to do with child marriage and the tension with fertility rates. Is it fair to say that in countries that are seeking to, lower fertility, the policy on child marriage goes hand in hand with that? And conversely, is it possible that here in the West, where we're worried about fertility rates, declining fertility rates, this worry is sort of making itself felt, as a kind of laxity in curbing child marriage?
So I think you're asking whether more stringent child marriage laws could be used as a tool for reducing fertility rates in some parts of the world,
Yes.
and conversely whether being less stringent on child marriage could actually increase fertility in other contexts. There's certainly discussion of high fertility rates among children who start childbearing at an early age. Girls who marry as children tend to have their first child at an earlier age and tend to have shorter birth intervals. But I would redirect the conversation, and I think much of the conversation is being redirected towards desired fertility rather than population control. And I think it's particularly relevant, and I included the information here about women reporting more unwanted pregnancies. Right? They themselves say that they want to control their fertility rather than using this as a mechanism of population control. When we get into discussion of national level population control, often that has to do with global resource use, and I think that if we're going to go in that direction, there are policies that are much better implemented in more resource-rich areas of the world that would get at the same outcomes more effectively. There are a number of countries, wealthier countries, Denmark, for instance, that have tried policy approaches to increasing fertility among their populations. I haven't seen, it may be that it exists and I'm not aware of it, about whether or not that's been effective in terms of increasing fertility rates where, again, the government deems that is in the national interest.
But they didn't do it by asking their children to reproduce.
No, they've done it by offering additional vacation time and love vacations or things like this. A number of Eastern European countries, I think, have implemented similar policies. I don't know whether or not that's been effective, but given the harms that we know are associated with early marriage, I would think that it would be a particularly unappealing way of working to try to increase fertility rates. Any other questions?
I can think of all kinds of quantitative ways to pursue this. Have you thought about linking past censuses to CCHS to find out marriage history, first marriage of current population?
I haven't.
So that would be, I mean, not just CCHS, but any data source. I mean,
There is certainly room
Everything's
for
open to
data
linking now.
linkages that Statistics Canada will be here next week that are ripe for discussion. I'm not aware of any that currently exist, nor do I have the money to ask Statistics Canada to try to do those linkages for me, but it's a possibility that could be explored in the future.
So super interesting. I mean, it always raises new questions for me, and this is really, I hesitate to ask this, but I just, you see this very pronounced decline in reported marriage rates between 2006 and 2016. Did you find a similar, using the census data, did you find a similar decline over time using the vital statistics?
Vital stats, yes.
You do?
It's declining.
I mean, so I wonder how much, I have to say, in 2000, which is when you start collecting it, like, child marriage was not on the international agenda. It just started to, become kind of a thing in sort of the mid-2000s, and so it seems like to some extent you're highlighting the hypocrisy of the Canadian government,
Yes.
but you're focusing on a very long time period, and you're also, for good reason, focusing on numbers rather than percentages. Like if you added that percentage to that map that you showed, I'm not sure the color would change that much. It's pretty close to white, right? The shading at less than 1% is still going to be. So I'm just wondering two things. Like wondering whether or not it would be good to add more of a time element to show that the trends are certainly pretty downward in Canada. So how urgent is it that we change these policies if in fact it seems to be happening anyway? And the difference between percentages and numbers.
Very good points, both. In the full paper, I do show trends in vital statistics and show that they are falling. In the interest of time and detailedness, they're not in this presentation for this audience. I think that one of the important points I tried to make was that, yes, there are huge differences in scale, right? If you use the same color scale and tried to show 0.2% on that map, you wouldn't see much of a color change. But we could change the whole scale, right? And then it gives this impression that child marriage isn't only happening in these parts of the world, right? My qualm with those images is that it allows us to think that this isn't a problem elsewhere. And yes, it might be particularly rare in Canada. It's a little bit less rare in the United States. But I think it does something to our perception of what development issues are and where they happen if we acknowledge that it's on a spectrum. And that spectrum might start very low and go very high, but if we show that this is not restricted, that wealthy countries struggle with the same issues and probably for some of the same reasons, then the conversation gets less us and them, right? We get at a more global conversation. Have any countries actually been able to eliminate child marriage? How did they do it? What were the discussions that were necessary? What are the differences in these countries where it is particularly rare versus the ones where it's high? And how can we learn some of the lessons that were needed? And that's why I say I think it's been my experience in dealing with this issue with some of the federal agencies as well, that they are aware of it, they're aware of the discrepancy, they just wish it would go away.
Mm-hmm.
They just wish that no one was highlighting it. Because it's a political issue that nobody wants to touch, right? To try to, for a number of reasons. There are a number of political interests that might oppose a raise in the minimum age to 18. And it's not, you could very much argue in a political sphere that it's not the most pressing issue among Canadian youth at this moment. It is a small percentage. That doesn't mean it's not an issue, and that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do about it.
Okay, last question?
mentioned that there was a policy change in 2016. Do you know what the trigger was or what type of discussion took place before that?
That's a very good question. I've started very recently with the help of a law student that's assisting with my research to go through some of the debates that were happening around 2015. I don't yet know what the arguments, I mean, I can hypothesize, but I don't have the words from legislators' mouths about why they were arguing about 16 and not setting it higher. I don't know.
Thank you for joining. Thank you. Thank you.